Michael, it's been a few weeks now since the fantastic qualification. How do you assess what you achieved in that qualification period?
I think it's probably something over the last few weeks I've probably reflected on a bit more than at the actual initial qualification. Obviously, the mood is phenomenal. The players to experience what we did against Greece and to be on the pitch, see what it meant to the supporters is something that obviously was memorable. But I think now, I suppose it sinks in what we have achieved and what this group of players have achieved. And it's really important for me that the game in November, that we had a home game, because after the Greece game, we were on a plane the next morning to Finland. We needed obviously a point to win the group, which we got. But the players on return from Finland then dispersed to all different parts of the UK. They go back to their clubs. So they never really got maybe to appreciate what it meant to everyone in Northern Ireland. And so the game against Latvia gave us that opportunity. We were at home for 4 or 5 days. I think they fully understood what it meant to everyone. And it was really important because now, I think it helps them refocus and look at, we're going to the finals, fantastic. It's 6 months away or 7 months away at that point in time. But, we go there with obviously, a mission to do well and to continue the great work that they've done.
Do you sort of look at that qualification table and see Northern Ireland at the top and think, how did that happen?
Yeah, I've looked at it now and again, to be honest. You know what I mean? I've reflected on the campaign, and I think that the biggest thing was the the growth in the team. That I think there were signs of that anyway in the last campaign, although the results didn't reflect that, but there were certainly signs of that. And then obviously seeing it come to fruition in this campaign was huge for us. And you start out when the draw comes out, right, let's finish in the top 3, and then you win your first 3 games and the mood changes a little bit and you think we could maybe get in the top 2 here, and then you've 4 games to go and you're like a point behind Romania, and then after I think the Faroes game we were top at that point in time, and you think if we win on actually game 8 we've now qualified. And it was just the journey for the players, the confidence, the belief, and the most pleasing thing for me was that having qualified obviously after the Greece game was that they refocused. Listen, first of all, they enjoyed themselves, which they're entitled to do, and but they refocused so quickly to make sure that we got what we needed in Helsinki, because they really did want to win the group, and it was a fantastic achievement.
You mentioned the word confidence and belief, but those must have been in very short supply at the beginning of the qualification process after what had happened in the World Cup qualifying group.
Yeah, I think we had a scenario like in terms of, I always felt there was a bit of a hangover from the Euro 2012 campaign. It had ended badly, and I think they'd lost the last 4 games and home and away defeats to Estonia, and I just felt that we probably carried that period when you come in as a new manager from really January until the World Cup qualifying campaign. There's very little motivation for the players, even though you're a new manager. We had 3 games in that period. One of them was in June. The players weren't enthused about that game, and so you want to try and build something, and you've got a group of players that kind of, their focus is elsewhere, and that was very difficult. That was probably the most difficult period in the job, if I'm honest. The biggest thing we did, off the back of the World Cup campaign, as I say, you have a period then of maybe about 6 to 7 months before the Euros, and actually even before the draw. And our first game, I think we had a friendly away in Turkey. Difficult game. We lost the game 1-0, but we did well in the game. I remember thinking we've played well here tonight, and it was Fatih Terim's first game back in charge of Turkey. It was a good competitive friendly. It's 25,000-30,000 at the game, good atmosphere. And then we played Cyprus away, and we played poorly. It was 0-0, poor game. You kind of at that point thinking, right, how can we, sort of invigorate this a little bit from where it was. And the biggest thing for me was, I took the World Cup group and I showed the players. We had a meeting. I showed the players the group, and I took Portugal and Russia out of it. I said, can we win this group with a 4-team group? And they're pretty unanimous. Of course we can win that group. And then I showed them the 10 games, and I says, there was the score in the games at 75, 80 minutes. I said, look, how many games, that shows you how close you were to finishing 3rd in the group. Although we finished 5th, we could quite easily have finished 3rd behind Portugal and Russia. So I think that they started to see that, they started to recognise that. But we had to change the mentality a little bit, that we had to, we had to turn up, and we had to find a way to win more than anything. And the Hungary game did that really, because we went behind. and we'd played well in the game. We didn't really deserve to be behind. They scored off a corner, and it was a little bit unfortunate. You know, Gareth McCauley had come off injured. 2 minutes later, you know, they scored off a corner. Gareth's obviously our you know, probably our biggest, you know, centre back in terms of defending set pieces. So it was just circumstance. I think we've done well here, and things have gone against us again here, and we're going to lose this game 1-0. You know, and then, you know, Kyle, who had played great in the game, you know, came to the party and made the first goal and scored the winner. And Niall had come on as well. Niall had a big impact in that game, scoring the first goal and obviously setting up the second as well for Kyle. So, and I just think that was probably the turning point for this group of players, really, because we were losing that game. You know, we would have almost, there would be an expectation to say, we were a bit unlucky, we played well, we lost the game 1-0. Well, no, actually, we fought our way back into the game with 20 minutes to go and won the game 2-1. And then after that, you could just see it then start to, you know, develop and grow as every game came around.
Before the qualifying campaign got underway, and because it had been such a poor World Cup qualifying set of results, were there senior players who were starting to think, is it worth my while turning up to play games? Were you having to convince some of the senior players to carry on playing for their country?
No, I didn't really, to be honest, and that was one of the most pleasing aspects of it. You know, people always think that, you know, when I took the job, I had, you know, Chris Baird at the time was a little bit unsure. You know, he wanted a little bit of time away from international football, which I gave him, and you know, he came back and played. His first game was my third game, for example. Aaron had retired under Nigel, and you know, I'd sat with Aaron and gone through this, what we wanted to do, what we believed we could do, and at the time, Billy McKinley was working with me, who was working at Fulham with Aaron as well, so that probably helped me in that side of things, and Chris was at Fulham as well. But you know, the preparation of the team has been fairly constant from day one on how we've gone about things, and you know, we've just seen obviously a better set of results than we did do in the opening campaign. But no, the most pleasing aspect for me was that the players didn't. I think that they did believe that we were going in the right direction. I genuinely felt that they felt that as well. You know, I had conversations with Stephen, and you know, I'm like, do we need to do anything different? How do we approach this? How can we change this? And he you know, he was fairly, you know, firm. No, listen, we just need to keep doing what we're doing, and it will turn for us, or we'll be more competitive, certainly. And you know, so it was great for me that, you know, the likes of, you know, your Gareth McCauley's, you know, Aaron Hughes, Chris Baird, Chris Brunt. You know, there was no issue with that. They were fully focused on the Euros. I think they obviously saw the situation. I was able to sell it from the point of say, listen, now, you know, there's an expanded qualification process, more teams at the final. This probably will be our best chance. And, you know, they didn't need any convincing.
Just put into perspective for people who don't know, the resources that you have got to draw on compared to other countries.
Yeah, we have a limited pool of players. There's no getting away from that. And listen, you know, I'm not, you know, I suppose bleating about that for want of a better word. I think that, like, you know, Northern Ireland have always had a limited pool of players. What we probably had in the past was we had more players playing at a higher level of the game. I look back at the squad that I played in, and pretty much, whilst we didn't have a huge pool of players, every player was affiliate to a Premier League club at that point in time, or a Championship club. Now we're picking players from obviously League 2, you know, League 1, SPL in Scotland, which, you know, isn't the strongest league, if we're honest, you know. And so, you know, we have 7 players in the Premier League. That includes young Paddy McNair, you know, the 3 lads at West Brom, Stephen Davis, Kyle Lafferty, and Craig Cathcart, who's done extremely well at Watford.
But Kyle can't even get a game at Norwich.
Yeah, I mean, that's the situation you face. You have a situation with a player who you know, Northern Ireland have had that in the past with David. You know, David Healy was phenomenal for Northern Ireland, despite maybe his club situation not being as healthy as it could be. And you know, that's what we faced with Kyle. And you know, I think he's in a difficult situation because he's played extremely well for us. You know, he's had a great campaign, and you know, he's in a situation at his club which, you know, he's not really in control of. You know, he's not getting many opportunities either, to be fair to him. It's not as if he's had a lot of opportunities. He went 6 months on loan to Turkey because he wanted to play games. He wanted to make sure when the game came around for us in March against Finland and against Romania in June, that, you know, he was playing first team football, which he was, and he scored 2 goals against Finland, and he actually could have won the game for us in Romania. He was at home to Romania. He was disappointed. He missed a good chance. The goalkeeper made a good save, but you know, it is a difficult situation for him because he's so important to us. He is so important to us. How we play, he does give you, that outlet that we need, and hopefully, as I say, between now and the finals, that his club situation improves, whether it's at Norwich or whether it's elsewhere. And then we go in, we have 6 players in the Championship, for example, and then the rest of the lads that make up the squad are either, as I say, League One, League Two, or the SPL. But we bring the biggest, I think, I suppose, compliment to our squad is really there's a really strong spirit in the squad. So it doesn't matter, if a player who's in the Premier League and a player who's in League Two, there's no difference. How they interact with each other, how they respect each other is very much, it's across the board. There's a healthy respect amongst the group and amongst the players. And I think that's testament to the types of Premier League players that we have. We see a lot of things. Premier League players do a lot of things now that can put people off them. But our lads, I have to say, are exemplary. And they've been fantastic in terms of how they've moulded and built that spirit within the squad. But we ask players to step up. Conor McLaughlin's the best example of it. We have a lad who's playing at Fleetwood Town who are toiling a little bit in League One at this moment in time, but he was stepping up, and he played 9 of the 10 games that we had in the campaign, and he didn't look out of place. He held his own. He was one of our best players over the piece of the campaign as well. And so I think it's always pleasing when you find a player like that, or a player comes in and steps up and is not only able to come into the team and do well, but actually stay in the team and actually enhance the team. And Conor has done that. Oliver Norwood's obviously done that, established himself as well. Stuart Dallas, for example, a player now at Leeds, but 18 months, 2 years ago, Stuart Dallas was on loan at Northampton from Brentford. Now he's an established Championship player. I think people really see his worth, and he came into the international. Came in halfway through the campaign, and he gave us that boost on the left-hand side that we needed.
How do you try to find additions to that squad? Are you always combing the ancestry records of players who are played?
Yeah, we do a lot. The internet's a great thing. You can find so much information out about people. We have people on the ground. We try and find players, but I think the biggest thing, it's not a case of just casting the net and finding anyone with a Northern Ireland bloodline that will come and play for us, because our team is essentially boys that are born in Northern Ireland. If you look at our campaign, Hungary, the Hungary game was a perfect example in that we used 14 players. 13 of them were born in Northern Ireland. Only Oliver Norwood was the one that wasn't. Jamie Ward was injured that game, and probably Jamie and Ollie are the 2 that starting players that have played the most through the campaign, who have come to us through eligibility. Ollie's been in our system since under 17, for example, as well. So I think it's important that you can improve your squad. Of course it is, but equally, I think those players have to be better than what you have. It's not just a case of taking players for the sake of it. So we keep a close eye on all of our players. We, as I say, in total we probably have about 45 to 50 players in the 4 leagues in England and the top 2 leagues in Scotland, and so we continue to monitor them all. And I suppose for us the big thing is that international football for our players can enhance their club career, and I think that's important. So if we have a Conor McLaughlin just playing for Northern Ireland, give him the opportunity potentially to play at a higher level, and will people obviously view him and see his worth at a higher level. So it's a lot of work, but equally, as I say, we have to do that. We're not blessed with a huge resource.
When you took over, it was in the middle of a period when there were concerns that a lot of players were choosing to play for the Republic of Ireland instead. Has that stopped now, or is that still going on, or what have you done to try to address that? Well,
we've done an awful lot at underage level. When I came in, there wasn't really any structure there, if I'm honest. There wasn't a set underage structure, and after maybe about a year and having looked at the whole situation, I brought Jim Agilton, came in as performance director, as a title that was given, and basically we've tried to restructure underage football in terms of our better players at underage now are working with the association up to 3 times, 4 times a week, from and obviously they with their clubs or with the association, they play with their clubs and they represent, and we've given them greater exposure at international level. So we're now taking kids away under what we've called it is Club NI, under the Club NI umbrella, and we take them away from the age of 10, 11, 12, which would never have happened in the past, to be honest. We put good people in. Stephen Robinson came in with me from the start. He's obviously working with the senior squad now, and he works with Motherwell. But like Stephen did a huge amount of work at 17s, 19s, 21s. Stephen Craigan is now at 19s. Jim takes the 21s. So we put people who I felt it was very important to put players, ex-players in place, but maybe ex-players that the younger players could still identify with. David Healy, for example, did a lot of work in Club A&I as well. So just to have David around it and have young players, interact with David was very important as well. Obviously, before he ultimately took the Linfield job a few weeks back as well. So, I think what we're trying to do is we want the young players of Northern Ireland, obviously, to play for Northern Ireland. We recognise that they have the option to go and play for the Republic of Ireland, but we hope that by taking them from such a young age that they have some sort of, not loyalty is the wrong word, but I think an affiliation to say, well, actually, Club A&I, Northern Ireland, played a big part in my development. The wrong thing for me to do now is to go and play for the Republic of Ireland. Listen, we still have one or two that have done it, but any time any of those situations has ever arisen, to be honest, I've addressed it myself. I've sat with players. Their parents, their agents. We spoke to them and says, listen, I'm not sure this is the right thing to do. I think asking a young player to change his international allegiance, say between the age of 17 and 21, is a poor decision by any association, because that player then has no other option for the rest of his career. And I think that it's something that should be looked at, because young players make rash decisions and they make them maybe emotionally based or whatever it may be, and they regret it. I know loads of lads that have made that decision that have regretted it, because it didn't turn out to be what they were promised or what they felt it was going to be, and they're ultimately now they're Northern Ireland born players who cannot play for Northern Ireland. And I think that that's something that I think has to be addressed at the higher levels of the game. That if it comes at senior international level, that's fine, but don't be asking a young player to change his allegiance between 17 and 21.
But it might be understandable for young lads if they've grown up in a family or a community who identify and support the other team in Ireland rather than Northern Ireland. It's very difficult for them to be with their peers and perhaps play for Northern Ireland.
Totally, yeah. I have never criticised any player that's done that. When I took the job, James McLean was in the process of going through what's called the international transfer, and I tried to talk James out of it, and James ultimately stuck to his decision, which is fine. I've seen James since and we speak. There's no animosity there from me on any part, and it's nice to see him do well. I was at the game yesterday, West Bromwich Albion, he scored a great header, so I would never criticise a player for that at all. And I understand that, I've grown up in Northern Ireland, I grew up in a Catholic family myself, so I totally understand, that side of things. But, this team, like, what I will say is, and the whole time I ever played for Northern Ireland, we always had a great mix in the squad. There was never an issue, there was never a religious issue amongst the players at all. There was some times when obviously the atmosphere in the stadium could have been better. I don't think anyone will ever, hide behind that. But the IFA have done a fantastic job, and in changing that. I think the atmosphere at the National Stadium, Windsor Park now, is fantastic. And it is totally for both sides of the community. Our team represents both sides of the community, and long may that continue. That's what when it came in, that's what we wanted to build, and hopefully I think the biggest thing for myself and Jim and the lads at work, Stephen Craig and Stephen Robinson, is that any young player who's born in Northern Ireland aspires to play for Northern Ireland, and that's kind of what we're hoping to create.
You mentioned your own background. Has your background helped in those negotiations with some people, do you think?
Possibly, yeah, I don't know. Possibly it has, I think that maybe people look at it slightly different. I can't, and I suppose I'm not the best person to answer that really, but certainly, we have a very open outlook to it, and as I say, Jim's done a huge amount of work that way, and as I say, we just want to bring lads both sides of the community. They're training 3 nights, 4 nights a week together. We're bringing lads from Derry, lads from Belfast, lads from all over the country, bringing together. They're working on a regular basis. They're the best players in the country, and ultimately, as I always say to our young players, that they're never that far away. I first worked with. I took the job. I first worked in our excellence programme with Liam Donnelly, who's a young player at Fulham, on an AstroTurf pitch in Cookstown, and 3 years later I put him on against Chile in a senior international. So, you know, I want our young players to recognise that, you know, because of our resource, the opportunity to play international football is with Northern Ireland. There's no doubt about that, and it will always be there. Like, you know, our numbers are nowhere near the extent of, you know, the Republic of Ireland. You know, I think the Republic have over 50 players in the Championship alone, for example. So that gives you an indication. So, you know, there's a thought process that has to go into it for a player, and their representatives say, well, actually, if you want to, you know, Northern Ireland will represent the best opportunity for you to play international football. You know, I think we have the capability to deal with one or two retirals, but ultimately our squad will be weaker, and we may not have the resource to back things up if we have injury or suspension. So, you know, I've enjoyed the job for 4 years. I've always said that, you know, if continuing the job, that, you know, I'll continue to do it the way I have done it. And, you know, one thing that football has taught me, you know, having played for 13 or 14 clubs, is, you know, it's dangerous to look too far ahead, particularly as a manager. So, you know, if I get the, you know, if I continue in the role, which is where my focus is at the minute, you know, I'll continue to do it. But equally, you know, if a club situation arises, I think, you know, as a manager, you always have to look at that. And as I say, it's a case of, but for me, as I say, the main focus is purely on France.